Hello and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'm going to be showing you the meta comps for patch 12.18. First up we have Mage Nomsy. Now you can only play this one in every 3 games when Nomsy is in fact a mage, and it's very simple to play. You're usually just playing Astral Opener into a fast 7 on 3-5 or 4-1. You roll down for your Nomsy 2-star, then you can go fast 8, roll down for legendaries, or you can go fast 9. The reason that this comp is so good is because they buffed the hell out of 5 mage, and even 7 mage isn't too bad. If you get any mage augments or mana gen, then you're going to be in a really good spot. Nomsy needs 1 mana gen item, usually just Shojin. Blue buff's okay for a first fast cast, but she has a high mana pool, so Shojin's a lot better. Then you want some AP. Usually Rabadon's is better than Archangels because you're going to be doing a lot of damage at the start of the fight. Plus you don't have frontline, so it's hard to stall with this comp. You can go for IE Jewel Gauntlet, but you need to have AP in other areas, usually with Chalice stacking. Other than that, you can go for Giant Slayer to kill the front line. Most of the time she's just going to nuke the back line anyway, so Giant Slayer doesn't seem as necessary. You can play around units such as Bard and Zoe ideally for that 7 mage synergy, as well as the fact that she's a really good unit. Seraphine's quite nice because she gives Mystic, which synergizes as well with Bard and any other units. If you need more frontline, then I highly recommend picking up some ZZ Rots, as Silas and Vlad usually aren't going to cut it. Otherwise, if you find yourself a Yasuo, you can go for Mage Yasuo. Otherwise, something just like a Val Hecarim can work as well. Next up, we have the 3-star Seraphine comp. Now, the reason that this comp is so good is because 3-star Seraphine is absolutely broken. The only downside to this comp is that if you have a lot of Psalm players in your lobby, then Seraphine's usually going to be contested. However, you can stabilize by rolling down at 7 to hit this exact board. You're going to be playing around a Val, Zac as your frontline, and then you have Pantheon and Zyra giving Whispers, so you don't actually need any anti-MR or armor, as the Whisper synergy will do that for you. Graves can hold on you to all of your AD items, Pantheon your tank items, and of course Seraphine wants to have Shojin, Morello, and Rabadons. You can also go for Archangels instead of Rabadons, but I think that first cast is really significant, so try and play around that. The main advantage to this comp is that Seraphine will hit the majority of your team, so if you have items such as Zeke's and then some attack speed items on your Graves, you're going to be applying that on hit really quickly. Now, you don't actually have to go level 8 with this comp. You can stay on level 7 and slow roll for Seraphine 3. However, if you're heavily contested, you might as well push levels, and then you can fit in a Bard, guarantee that you 2-star your Graves and your Pantheon. You can also play Yasuo if you can get to 9, or play it over Bard until you hit. If you're playing around Lagoon Opener and you hit more Psalm items than you do Seraphine, then instead you can pivot into the vertical Lagoon comp, which is just 6 Lagoon plus mages. If you're lucky enough to get a mage spat, you can play around 5 mage, which is usually going to be Mage Zyra. If you think you need the frontline, you can of course go Mage Yasuo as well. This comp revolves around blue buff Morello Psalm, and then you can also play Nyla to finish off the backline, or a Mage Zyra will do the trick as well. The last item on Psalm can literally be anything. You mainly just want the blue buff plus Morello for faster first cast, as well as applying that anti-heal to the entirety of the team. Usually I like to go for anything like Rabadons or Archangel as the last item though. Tank items of course go on your Silas, and this comp does really well with ZZ Rots as it often lacks frontlines, which you can just place on your Malphite. And the final S tier comp we have is a fast 9 into Dragons. Now, you usually only play this comp after you've already played something else, and eventually you make it to 9, usually on stage 6. However, if you have a really good econ opener, you can sometimes make it to 8 on stage 5, and you're usually playing around a Terra frontline with an Aoshin as your main carry. Of course, you can play Asol instead of Aoshin, but Aoshin caps a lot higher. Then your Morello holder is usually going to be Shyvana. You're always playing 4 dragons, as the 4th dragon only takes up 1 slot with the way that the trait works. And then as for the other 2 units, if you're playing around a Shyvana carry, you can play Rakan Bard. This gives you Mystic as well as Guardian for the Idis and that 4th Rage Wing for Shyvana. However, if Shyvana's not that significant of a unit, then you can pretty much play whoever. You can play around Yasuo, Bard. Sometimes you can even play Soraka if you think that you need the healing. And of course, if you are playing around Aoshin as your main carry and you have good Yasuo items, you can technically run a Lee Sin. Not only does this give you anti-MR, but it also gives you Dragomancer for your Yasuo and that 4th Tempest for your Aoshin. Although do keep in mind, you usually cap higher than Lee Sin, so he's just a temporary unit for now. Now, starting out in A tier, we have Guild Xayah. Now, the trick to playing this comp is usually to play it from ahead, as you cap out really high. However, if you don't hit your core upgrades or you miss Shyvana, then you're going to be bleeding out during stage 4 or stage 5. Best in slot for Xayah is definitely Rageblade GS +1. The last item can be anything, Runins, Deathblade. You can even go Titans because she stacks it quite quickly. Your frontline ideally is going to be a Protector's Vow on your Hecarim. This allows him to cast after just 1 auto, and it allows your Jace and Shyvana to have a little bit more time so that they can actually cast afterwards. And with this setup, you're going to be having a Hecarim ult into a Jace ult into a Shyvana ult, and if the enemy doesn't have any anti-CC, then they're going to be in trouble. It's usually going to be 6 Rage Ring with Xayah, Rakan, Hecarim, and Shyvana. Your Swift Shot is going to be Twitch, and you cap your board at level 9 by playing your Bard, of course. Usually it's going to be Sedge over Bard, as the mana gen's not that important in this comp. However, playing Bard for 1 round if you do find him on 8 before you find your Shyvana is quite a significant upgrade, as going from 4 to 5% odds after farming 1 dude does allow you to hit Shyvana 25% more easily. All of your tank items go on your Jace, as he's going to be the main one taking aggro. Shyvana loses aggro after she casts, so she's really good at applying items such as Morello, and she does a lot of damage with Spark, but try not to put your tank items on her. Of course, if you don't have a Vow for Hecarim, then you're going to want to frontline your Jace, as Hecarim won't cast if he doesn't have a mana item, and he takes all of the aggro if they have a lot of high DPS. This board cap's extremely high with Shyvana 2 and then of course Bard 2 on level 9, but make sure that you're not upgrading to Bard 2 before you've hit some of your other units, as the 15 gold for Bard 2 is not really worth it. You can of course go for Swift Shot Hecarim if you've instead don't have a Vow on him and you want to frontline your Jace instead. Just keep in mind that this comp does like frontline if you don't hit that Jace 2-star or you don't have a Vow on your Hecarim. Next up we have Deja, which can be played in a lot of different ways depending on what the Mirage is. The only Mirage that I would definitely stay away from Deja is Electric Overload, as it's really hard to play around Deja with this Mirage variant, as it doesn't benefit Deja at all, it only benefits your frontline really. So normally you're going to be playing around an Idis frontline. Of course you're going to cap with Yasuo, so most of the time you're going to be playing around 6 Mirage. The only time you play 8 Mirage is if you have a spat, and most of the Mirage don't actually benefit too much from 8 anyway, so staying at 6 is usually fine. The default items for Deja is going to be Archangel's GS +1. The only time that you don't want this item combination is if it's Spell Sword. You would much rather have Rage Blade and you don't need the Archangels because you're going to be ramping up AP anyway. Instead you want to make sure that you prioritize Rage Blade and Zeke's, and then your other items are pretty flexible. If the Mirage is Warlords, then you don't want to be running Archangels either, as you're going to have a really high base AP from the Warlords synergy. Instead you can go for Aegis Gauntlet +1. Remember that whether or not you carry Idis as your main tank or Nunu is dependent on what the Mirage is. If the Mirage is Dawnbringer or Warlords, then Nunu gets a huge buff from the AP and HP, and you'd much rather carry him. If you instead have a spat and you can put the Mirage spat on your Idis, then it doesn't really matter. Other things that cap out this board are going to be blue buff on your Yasuo, as well as Cav Spat that synergizes quite well. If you're not running Idis, of course you can drop Leona and play Yone. Remember that the Warrior synergy is pretty fake, but if you're going to have a choice between running a Leona or a Yone, neither of which give the Guardian synergy, then of course you just run the Yone instead. Remember that Hecarim with a Vow is also a really big upgrade to this comp, and of course at level 9 you can cap out with things such as Bard and or Soraka. And a reroll comp making its way into A tier is Scale Scorn. Now usually you want to stay level 7 and reroll for Olaf and Diana, and the trick to playing around this comp is actually dual carrying the Olaf and the Diana. You don't want to stack Olaf too hard in stage 2, however it'd be ideal if he dies, so usually the opener for this board is if you get dropped an early Olaf or Diana, play around Astrals so that you can 3-5 it if you're low HP, otherwise you just 4-1 and you're going to be rolling down at level 7. Item priority for this comp is usually going to be Spark on your Diana, then Bramble if you think there's a lot of crit in the lobby, and then your Olaf items are pretty flexible. Usually you just want attack speed and AD. Olaf can use items such as Giant Slayer and RFC really well. You can also go for IE to amplify your damage. However, keep in mind if you are playing around a Runers, then the Runers bolts won't be critting, so Runers IE is usually pretty bad synergy. As for healing, if you don't have an RFC, you usually want to have BT or a Hodge. Remember that the Hodge gives crit chance, so when you're playing around IE, then the increased damage from Hodge is very much worth it. Otherwise, the BT shield's usually quite nice. The reason that you want Spark on your Diana is because when you're playing around 4 Scale Scorns, not only does this increase the AP damage that you're doing by lowering their MR, but the direct damage will also be increased by Scale Scorn as well. This is why augments such as Electro Charge do so well in this comp. Usually you don't actually want to run healing in this comp at all, so it's much better to get augments such as CB or Thrill. And something else that's interesting to note is because you're playing around 2 mages, you can go for a mage cap on your Hecarim and it actually does a double cast, which is really significant to the fights. Otherwise, if you're lucky enough to go 8, you can play a Zoe. Also keep in mind that Pantheon has built-in anti-heal, so you usually want to position your Olaf and Diana on the same side as him and then spread out your Silas to the other side so you're applying the anti-MR and armor to the whole board. Next up we have the Whisper board, which is just vertical whispers plus playing around Yasuo, legendaries, and any other evokers that you hit. Now the weird thing about this board is you're just abusing the fact that Zyra is a ranged whisper, so with a Rage Blade she stacks up AD and AP really quickly, and you don't actually need to 3-star her. What you're going to be doing with this board is rolling on 7 or trying to go fast 8 if you're high rolling, hitting this board roughly, and then you're going to be mainly prioritizing frontline items whilst getting a Rage Blade for your Zyra. If you don't have enough frontline, then Zyra is never going to ramp up, so it doesn't matter how many items she has on her. If you think that the fights are going to be going for a long time, then technically the highest DPS you can go for is Rageblade Runas +1. Edge of Night's really good in Assassin lobbies, and Hextech's really good if you think that you need the healing. Although do keep in mind, if you're playing around multiple Evokers as well as Bard, Zyra's going to be casting more frequently, which means that the damage amp from Runas is actually going to be lower, and you'd be better off going for some of the other items. However, if you don't play Evokers with this board, then usually you can play around the Runas and it's quite good. Also, something to note is that you can of course play Nomsy if she's an Evoker, and this gives you a Lulu, which gives attack speed to your Zyra. Usually your tank items are going to be going on Pantheon, as he's a better tank than Siphon, especially when Siphon just dashes away, although do keep in mind that if you're low HP, you might want to sometimes itemize your Siphon if you 2-star him first. Excess items can just go on Yasuo, and then you can play around what other legendaries you hit. Of course, Bard and Raka work really well on this board. The final A tier board we have is Reroll Astrals. Now the way you play this board is by not leveling at all. At level 4 on 2-1, you hyper roll down to about 10 gold and try and 3-star as many 1 costs as possible. The reason that you want to hyper roll so deep on 4 is so that you can start to get those 3 stars, which increases the star level and increases the rewards that you get from the Astral Orbs. Usually you're going to be playing around Vertical Astrals with Silas as a frontline, as he gives you Bruiser and 3 Mage. Lux is going to be your default carry. Then when you push levels, you can usually add in a Twitch if you've got items on your Varus, and then also Jace is a nice unit, as not only does he synergize well with the guild, but he also gives Shapeshifter to your Nidalee and a really good stun. If you are playing around vertical mages, for example, you get a mage spat on your Varus, then of course you can play around Zoe and go for 5 mages. If Nomsy's a mage, you can also play around that and potentially get all the way up to 7 to 9 mage. Do keep in mind that if you do print ASOL orbs, you don't usually want to play ASOL until the absolute earliest of level 9, as ASOL takes up 2 slots and it's not worth it, because even though you get 8 Astral, the extra AP is not as good as getting, say, something like 7 mage, or just playing units such as Bard and Jace. The most important thing to note about this patch when playing this comp is you don't need to 3-star Varus. Usually once you 3-star everyone else, 14 is enough Astral star levels to just push levels. You can of course roll down for Varus 3 on 8 if you think that you're close to hitting him, but don't force it on level 7, as you'd much rather just fit in extra units than get the rewards of going from 14 star level to 15. Starting off in B tier, we have Tempo Soy. So the way that you play this comp is all about having a really strong mid game, and then you're usually playing for a top 4. Right now there's a guy who is currently really high ranked in Korea who's been playing a lot of this comp, and usually you're just going to be playing around your Soy items and then pushing levels, and eventually at level 9 you can cap out with Soraka and Yasuo. Now, the main problem with this comp is that it does lose out to capped boards. However, during the mid game, you can usually punish those players, as with this positioning, your Soy can sometimes wrap on the left side, and if you flip the positioning, you can do the same but on the right side. The board's actually not too bad, as it uses a lot of strong units. However, do keep in mind that the main strength of this board is that you are uncontested, and of course, when you start to get to later stages such as stage 6, if you haven't built up a lead in HP, then you're usually going to bleed out into your 4th or 5th. Soy items are relatively flexible, but usually you want to go for healing, so that's going to be BT or Hodge. Then I think Titans is probably the second best item, and the third items usually flex between anything such as Rageblade, Giant Slayer. You can even go for Runins or Last Whisper, although those are definitely suboptimal. And then your other items can be AP on Soraka, any tank items go on Jace, and then of course the standard blue buff plus healing on Yasuo is also quite good. Next up we have the Aphelios board, which most of you guys should be pretty familiar given how strong it was in the first week of this set. So you're just playing around 4 Cannoneers, which is going to be sacrificing your Senna with the Zeeks to the Dark Flight corner. Hecarim with the Vow on the front is going to be your front line, and then you're just stacking as many Aphelios as you can. Of course you can dual carry Graves later into the game if you get some items for him. Remember that often you don't actually really care about Aphelios 3, as you'd rather have 2 2-star Aphelios anyway. Usually you're going to be going for augments which buff the Cannoneers, as this is going to be the main carry to the comp. Make sure that you're giving 2 Zeeks to your main Aphelios, who's going to be having Last Whisper as well as another damage item, and then any other damage items can of course go onto your Graves. Usually you're not playing around Swain with this board, although if you don't have a Vow on your Hecarim, sometimes you can drop Hecarim and play around Swain instead. If you're lucky enough to get a Dragonmancer spat as the first augment, you can usually try and force 8 Demancer Lee Sin, as this board cap's really high with 3-star Lee Sin and 8 Demancer. The max damage build is going to be Dual Gauntlet plus Hodge, although the tank variation is usually going to be BT Titans plus 1. Do keep in mind that you need to 3-star the Lee Sin and you bleed out a lot until you get it, as 2-star Lee Sin is quite stable during stage 3 and usually falls off in stage 4, so the reason that this comp doesn't work in higher elos is because although it caps quite high, you often bleed out before you get your 3-star Lee Sin, and then once you do hit 3-star Lee Sin, you still lose some matchups. The way you play this board is just going to be vertical Dragonmancers. Then of course you can play Greys if you want to get that Tempest. And if you do manage to cap out at level 9, you can of course drop the Greys for Alshin to get 4 Tempest and then dual carry your Alshin with any items you get on Carousel. But usually you're not going to be getting to that stage anyway. And finally, moving into C tier, we just have 2 comps which are budget versions of the ones you've seen previously. So let's say you want to play around the Seraphine comp, but instead you just hit mostly tank items as well as AD. You can play a very similar board. Instead, you're going to be carrying Graves and Nyla as a dual carry, and your tank items are going to be going on Idis. So as you can see, the board is very similar. However, you're not really putting that many items on Seraphine, and she is not the main focus of this comp. The great thing about this board is you're going to be killing a lot of units as Graves takes care of the front line, and usually Nyla can pick off weak units in the background. The only downside to this is if the Idis item isn't very good and doesn't suit the board well, then you're going to have a really bad front line. And of course, if you don't get your Idis 2-star, then you're going to be having a non-existent front line, and it's going to be very hard to kill units. Now this board is a lot stronger, so usually I would try and play this if you think that you can go fast 8 and you have too many AD items. Otherwise, I think that the Seraphine 3 board is a lot more consistent. And the final comp today is going to be Rengar Nyla carry. You're usually going to be playing around 4 Assassin. You can sacrifice either your Kiana or Diana, and of course you're going to be giving them Zeeks. Good AD items can go onto your Nyla and or Rengar, especially if you get Rengar 3. Remember that IE synergizes really well with Assassins, and Hodge gives even more crit chance. So these are going to be the best items that you can place on either of them. Other defensive options such as Edge of Night, you can even go Titan stack quite well as well. Your front line is going to be Hecarim with a Vow. Of course you can play around Swain as well, but Hecarim with a Vow is usually a pretty safe bet to go with. Remember that the whole purpose of this comp is stacking those Zeeks, and your Nyla and Rengar are going to go crazy. Remember this is just a budget version of Aphelios, as it's a lot more expensive, and it's only slightly better if you actually hit everything. And that is the end of the video. I hope you guys did enjoy learning about the meta comps for patch 12.18. Of course, if you guys have any questions about how to play the comp more specifically with items, rolling patterns, or augments, or any of the above, then feel free to come check me out on Twitch. I'm more than happy to have a live discussion with you. Or you can leave comments down below and I'll be more than happy to answer them there. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.